All right, today we are looking at women and early slavery. So this is taking place really from the beginning of when Africans were brought over to the Americas, to colonial America, and then right up until you have the transition to really what becomes like Southern slavery when we talk about the Civil War, or right before the Civil War, and what slavery in the South was like. So we're not going to get into what slavery in the South is like. That will be a different lecture. This one's just purely looking at really early slavery and women in the colonial period, and its development into a race-based system. So just keep that in mind, as we're not covering all of slavery here. We're going to be looking at the other part when we get closer to the Civil War. So first, before we get into kind of the characteristics and what was going on, I want to set up a little bit of background, because it's important to understand what slavery was like around the world, and in order to really understand how the U.S., or it wasn't the U.S. at the time, but how colonial America approached slavery, and then how it changed to something that was very, very different. So if you're looking at not background with the United States or with colonial America, but we'll say past cultures and societies, because the reality is that slavery had been around since the beginning of civilization. You have Mesopotamians, the Egyptians. They participated in slavery, and it continued on. So slavery had a very long standing in world history. And there, throughout the world, through various time periods, there were several types of slavery that tended to be common. So the first was, and the biggest, the most often reason that people ended up becoming slaves was captured warriors. So when you had a battle or a war, those soldiers who were fighting and lost and surrendered and weren't killed, they usually were then made into either slaves, or for a select few, they were ransomed for money. So if you were wealthy, if you were nobility, then you were more likely to be ransomed for money, or if you were high ranking in certain cultures and societies. But slaves tended to be what a lot of societies, when they went to battle, captured warriors became slaves. And I think what's important with this to recognize is that this created a group of slaves that was a diverse population, right? It was not based on race. Especially because a lot of places, they fought many different groups of people. And so you would end up having societies that had slaves from a variety of different groups of people, ethnicities, cultures, societies. Because as they fought them, then those soldiers who lost, that didn't die, became slaves. There were occasional circumstances where that wasn't the case, but that was the most common. The next that you see is debt slavery. And now debt slavery has to do with owing money, right? So if you owed a lot of money, and this usually wasn't for a small amount, it was right that you owed a lot of money that you couldn't pay back, right? That you were in debt to a point that it wasn't something you were going to be able to make a plan for and pay back. Then you would put yourself into slavery. But although while it was called debt slavery, it was more like indentured servitude in many cases, because it usually had a term that was based on how much you owed, right? So they determined and calculated how much you owed, and how much then with the years of labor how many years you were going to work to pay it off. And then the idea was, as the person who you went into slavery for, they paid off your debt. And so then that was, you owed them. Now you had to work for them as a slave until that debt was paid off. And that was usually negotiated in terms of years beforehand, because otherwise you could get into the situation where you put yourself into debt slavery and said until your debt was paid off to them who paid your debt off. And then they're like, oh gosh, it's been 6 years, but you have only paid off 10%. And then they could keep you indefinitely. So it was all you, it was a contract. It was very much, right. We could put here that this was often like indentured servants, being an indentured servant and how that worked. Now, the other thing that could happen with debt slavery is if you didn't want to sell yourself into debt slavery, you could sell family members. And so there were cases of where wife or daughter were sold into debt slavery instead of you. The rationale for this was that the husband, as a man, was able to make more money, and so they could work on paying the person you were now a slave for faster, and then you would be freed sooner, because there usually were options to pay off your debt slavery. So not only did the person who purchased your debt and paid for your debt then have that time frame, but then other people could pay off that debt to the person that owned you technically for that time frame, and then you would have a shorter term of service. Of course, it was connected to patriarchal structure, and that men had the authority often of life and death over their family members, that allowed them to then subsequently choose to sell off their wife or daughter, or their sons, but more often it was wife or daughter, into debt slavery, for their specific debt. Some cultures had rules that you couldn't do that. You couldn't sell someone else for your own debt. But there were plenty that allowed family members to be sold off instead. So you saw both. You saw people that went in for themselves, and you saw family members that were sent into debt slavery for their husband or father's debt. The next was punishment. This was less common, but it did happen. And these were almost always a term service as well. So these tend to be like indentured servitude in that regard also. And so those are the three like past types of main. There's other smaller ones, but those are the main reasons, I suppose, for why someone ended up as a slave. What I want to look at next with that is how it was different from what becomes the United States slavery, right? So we're going to see as we look at early slavery, we're going to put race-based slavery here. Not race-based slavery, because we're going to see that the early colonial slavery was not, at the beginning, race-based. It's going to develop into that, and it's going to create a very fundamental shift in what slavery is and how slaves are treated from pretty much the rest of the world. And so that's we're going to look at that transition. But I want to establish kind of like what were the differences as far as from that, what it becomes, to what pretty much the rest of the world did. And again, this is somewhat generalization because it doesn't apply everywhere. There were exceptions to this, and sometimes it did depend on the owner and the individual and how they treated their slaves. And some things, even if there were laws saying you couldn't kill your slave, it didn't mean that in practical application of a real world function that never happened, and that there were no consequence for it. I think of Rome as a good example, that they had certain laws against killing your slaves and doing certain other things, and yet when people did kill their slaves, there wasn't always a consequence for it. Sometimes there was, sometimes there wasn't. So it often depended on the person and their status, which is kind of a universal thing around the world too. Those who are wealthier, those who have a higher status in society, tend to be able to get away with more stuff than those who don't. Kind of looking at what are the differences. Well, one, most of the time, again, generalizations, but most of the time, slaves were still regarded as human. Okay, and then that's important for when you're comparing later to the race-based system of slavery in the South, where that's not necessarily the case. And then we'll say rights, their rights as slaves varied, but just even the fact that you have a thing that says there were rights, does provide some differences. Most of the time, slaves could own money, and this usually applied to both men and women. You could purchase your freedom, right? So if you made money on the side and made enough money, you could buy your own freedom. You were allowed to buy goods because, well, one, you had money that you potentially had, and so you could buy goods. There was usually free time. This is an important one, where we'll see the South clamp down on free time and try to limit the amount of time that slaves are not working. There was some protection, as I mentioned, against slaves being killed. Again, it did vary, but there was some protection. And some societies did have protection against abuse. That was less, though. So this was, we'll put here, less common. But it still was something that took place. Okay, so that's just the background. I wanted to make sure that was clear as far as looking at if you're kind of generalizing slavery in the world in the past. These tended to be some of the things that, not only how you became a slave, but the rights and views of who slaves were, was a little more varied in that process. And so kind of keep that in mind when we get to early colonial slavery for women and then how it transitions. So what I want to look at next is African slavery, and oops, sorry, I dropped my pen, and the structure there, because that then brings us into how Europeans got involved and then transitioned to transportation of African slaves to the colonial America. So within African slavery, you have, right, a variety of, because we tend to think kind of Africa with the continent as this unified whole, and it wasn't. You had kingdoms, you had states, right, and towns and cities and so on and so on. And they had a variety of relationships with each other. Some were at war. Some got along and had trade. Some ignored others. But that there was war between some of these kingdoms and states as they tried to expand and become larger and more important. And so not surprisingly, they tended to follow a similar pattern, which was that we talked about with the past societies, is that captured warriors became slaves. So one of the things you see is that this largely was male dominated, right? It didn't mean that women weren't captured and made slaves some of the time. Men were a higher percentage of slaves in Africa because it was based on captured warriors. However, the other part of captured warriors is when a town or village was conquered, then sometimes the entire village, the women and children, were also taken as slaves. So what we can put that down to is that women and children, right, could be slaves if a village or town was captured. So that did happen too, but because you had an emphasis on warriors, that did shift that to a higher male-dominated based system. So what's also different then is kind of the conditions and structure. So we'll put that as a C here. Conditions and structures of slave. A lot of slaves were actually made administrators in given administrative work. This was especially popular. And let's see, administrative. I was going to say administrator. I guess that would have worked too. Administrative work. This was especially popular with kings. There were several kingdoms who didn't trust nobility. So you don't see this as often in smaller towns and stuff, but in some of the larger kingdoms, you actually have these kings that didn't trust the nobility because they thought that they were only out for their own personal gain. And so the belief was that slaves were more trustworthy. And so they had do their not their taxes, but like they do their the administrative work for keeping records for the treasury, for the day-to-day running of the kingdom. So that the belief was that they wouldn't manipulate the documents to their benefit or take advantage of the system, where there was a belief that nobles were more apt to do that. So this is significant because, if you're looking at the difference between, there were slaves that were field work, right? So there were slaves that were used as farmers. So I don't want to have it look like slaves were not used as farmers in any situation, but there was a much more varied system of what they did. Women still largely were domestic work. Were largely used for domestic work. And this is common in a lot of places. And you'll see that transition actually with white women, indentured servants, who then are going to shift solely to domestic work. But you don't have the same massive plantations in a lot of societies that you do in the US. Now, this isn't exclusive. Rome ended up having massive plantations, and they moved a lot of slaves that they captured from their Punic Wars as they expanded and put them into these plantation work. When you get a plantation-based system, whether, like I said, you see it in Rome, and then you see it again with the early colonial Americas, you always have a much worse system of labor and conditions. And you have a higher death rate of slaves when they're put into that position. So it's not like there weren't other societies that did have plantations. Rome did during the Roman Empire. But overall, you tended to see that was not the main system of use of slaves in a lot of societies, because they didn't have the same plantation kind of based system of labor. And so while they were used as farmers, it wasn't always within a plantation-based system, which was much more destructive and had a higher death rate. Women, for the most part, though, in African societies were used for domestic work. And then again, in African societies, farmers were smaller time farms and things like that. But yeah, around the world, like I said, women, if they were slaves, tended to be for two things: domestic or sex labor. And those tend to be the two main ways that women were put into slavery. Entertainers was a smaller component. Yeah, those are kind of the big ones. Is the two main, though, are domestic is number one, sex slaves as the second. Men were occasionally used as sex slaves, but that number was far less, whereas women were significantly used as sex slaves. That was always a danger as a woman being put into slavery, was that potential for that position. Concubine was another thing, that you weren't technically a slave, but you weren't technically free either. It has a different term for it, right? Concubines are interesting because throughout the world, you had the kings that had, often within systems where there were multiple wives. And then you had, and this was common in Asian kingdoms. The Middle East also had concubines as well. And so you'd have the king would have a couple wives, and then they would have hundreds of concubines. And in a way, concubines, like I said, were a type of slave, but not called a slave. Women were picked, often, like they would have the king, there would be searches for the most beautiful women in various towns. And then they would be selected by administrators who would then bring them to the king, who would decide who he wanted to be his concubines. And then they would continue to grow this group of women that were there solely for sex for the king. And this could grow to significant numbers, like in the hundreds and hundreds sometimes. And the reason for that was not because that the king even had sex with every single one of them on a regular basis, but because the more concubines you had, the higher wealth and status you tended to have as a king, because it was expensive to house concubines. And this is where they were not like slaves, because concubines were lived in essentially their own separate palace. And they were given a life of luxury in terms of material goods and food, and stuff, but they were slaves in the sense that they were captive to being a concubine and living in the palace. You couldn't go home, you couldn't reject it, you couldn't be like, nah, I'm good, I'm not going to be a concubine, thank you very much. You didn't get that choice. And once you were a concubine, you had no other alternative for what you did with your life, because you were a concubine often for life, with not only that king, but often then the king's successor, which was often his son. And you didn't get out of that. But you, like I said, you did live, they were dressed really well, they were living in essentially a separate palace, like I said, was created for them. And then they had eunuchs that guarded them. And eunuchs were men who also rarely had a choice, that were castrated or otherwise made, having their testicles chopped off or crushed, so that they couldn't have sex and could not have children. And mostly it was the important part of not having sex, so that they wouldn't have sex with the concubines, and because they didn't trust regular men to guard the concubines. To guard them was to protect them for the king, and also make sure they didn't leave. It was both; they were both protector and jailer, essentially. And then these women had kids from the king, and yet they never had the status of wife unless they. In some societies, they could be elevated to wife if the king didn't have the max number of wives he was allowed to, or one of the wives died. Sometimes a favored concubine would move into that position, but it was very rare. There was a ton of backstabbing in these harems, is what they were called, where especially if there was potential for you to become a wife, because if you did become a wife, and again, not every society was that possible, but if you, in societies where concubines could become wives, while it was rare, if it happened, your children would become legitimate then, and they would have potential to inherit not only the status of official prince and princesses, but also the wealth of the king. And while they may not become the king themselves, because they're probably not the first wife's children, that was usually the requirement, is the very first wife, her children were the legitimate heirs, they still got those titles and official positions, whereas concubines' children, while they were technically the sons and daughters of a king, they did not get the official recognition and titles of that. So there were definitely poisonings and murders that happened, as well as a jockeying for position as concubines. And then there were other concubines that absolutely tried to avoid any kind of interaction with the king. And if you had hundreds and hundreds of concubines, then, minus the very first night a concubine, essentially the first night a woman was made a concubine, she was forced to have sex with the king. After that, though, you might go a year and not ever see the king. Sometimes even longer, depending on circumstances and situations. So you have the variety of experiences, but again, this idea of living this life of caged luxury. And in one sense, like I said, being a slave in many ways, but not necessarily experiencing the hardship of forced labor and beatings and abuse that other slaves throughout history experienced. And that was a different type of system, right? Then you had slaves who were just used as sex slaves, who were slaves, who were treated as slaves, but were expected to have sex with their owners or other people whenever they were told. And those women often not only experienced regular abuse, but rape as well. And in general, because you could argue that the inequality of slave owner and slave never was going to allow for equal consent in that process, and most were not interested in doing that. A few, you tried to use it to their advantage to gain better treatment, but even then, it wasn't like a free choice in the matter, but rather a choice for survival in that circumstance. So women always had, and we'll see this throughout like various things, the aspect of sex, of sexual abuse and rape were always something that women had to contend with that men didn't have to very often. It's not that it didn't happen with men sometimes, but it was rare compared to women. And slavery was probably one of the most egregious areas of that abuse because of the nature of owner and slave, and that inability to have any freedom or agency to reject those sexual advances, and the belief that women were, slaves were free for the slave owners to have sex with whenever they felt they wanted it, and or to make them have sex with other people whenever they wanted. So while in African slavery, women were largely used for domestic work, there were sex slaves. We'll put that down, right? It's not it's more rare, but I think it's important, or where we should put it is maybe back over here, where we're looking at different types of slavery, right? Usually you went in as captured, punishment, debt slavery, but let's put right here too as women used for sex slaves or domestic labor, right? Because that was something that was common throughout. Okay, so you have those. One of the other differences, so sex slave wasn't different. These are conditions and structure, so it's not all different anyways. But the sex slave was common pretty much everywhere, even in colonial America and later in the United States. But the fact that women were largely used for domestic labor was different within African slavery and pretty much the rest of the world. The other thing that was a condition that was also going to be unique is a chance for freedom. So in a lot of places with slavery and Africa, again, Africa tended to follow the structures of slavery around the world. You had a couple options for freedom. One was to purchase your own freedom, or someone else purchasing it for you, right? And this was made easier by being able to earn money, and women were allowed to earn money as well as men. This was not just for men. And being able to purchase your own freedom or someone else purchasing it for you. The other one was that sometimes in certain kingdoms and societies in Africa, slaves were adopted into the family. And then when you were adopted into the family, right, that meant no longer a slave. Occasionally, there was like an adoption thing, but you were still a slave. But a lot of times, if you were actually officially made part of the family, in the true sense of being made part of the family, then you were no longer made a slave. So slaves that were seen as especially important to the family, that made connections, they often didn't work for life. And that's the other thing, is that in a variety of ways, right, was not always a lifetime thing. And so that's important as well, is that whether it was purchasing your own freedom, whether it was being freed after a term of service, because this was common with that unofficially, after a number of years, some slaves would be freed. Now, this wasn't for everyone, and there was no rule for this or law, but it was kind of a common practice that after slaves had worked for so many years, they were freed. And so that was an option, again, purchasing your own freedom or being adopted into the family and becoming an actual family member. Then they were no longer a slave. So those are kind of the basics of African slavery prior to Europeans showing up. Okay, and then we're going to look at outside forces. Well, this will be within African slavery, so we'll keep it with that. There are two main groups that came in and participated in the slave trade in Africa. You had the Europeans with the Portuguese first, and then the other Europeans who followed, and then you had the Ottoman Empire. And they were very different in structure. So I put Ottoman Empire second, but they were actually first. So let's look at them first. What you have, if you're looking at, I'll draw my horrible map here with this. So if this is, Africa, we'll pretend that I'm drawing an excellent map here of Africa. You're going to have kind of the northwest area and central, and so I guess I should have where it goes to like about here, where you have the Ottomans that came in and had overland slave trade, and this was done even earlier with Africans that participated in the slave trade, that were part of bringing slaves, usually with the salt trade. Salt was a major commodity that was very valuable. And so you would they'd bring these large slabs of salt, and sometimes slaves, and trade with salt and slaves in this region. So the Ottomans were really in this kind of area and region for slavery. And then you had the Europeans, and they went two parts. They went up this way and then this way, which then was by sea briefly into there. But you had a large overland area. And the Europeans then were on the coastal regions that came in and started in these areas here on the coast, and then expanded down to the Cape as well. So this is what's going to be the Atlantic slave trade eventually. So the Ottomans and stuff, they went back to the areas that they controlled in the Middle East and the surrounding areas, and the Europeans started the Atlantic slave trade. And were very, very different in kind of process and structure. The Ottomans, and we'll put, when we got the Ottoman here, we'll put, we'll start it over here, A. So this is still with the Ottoman Empire. They, one of the biggest things was that they traded with various African groups. The other thing was that it remained, we'll say, a more equal trading. And so what I mean by that is obviously not for the slaves, but between the Africans that were trading slaves and the Ottomans who were purchasing slaves. That it was on more equal footing. We'll see how the Europeans are going to kind of take over this system and create a lot more chaos. The other thing is it didn't significantly disrupt the whole system. And part of that was that it was a smaller number of slaves. The overall number of slaves within that region of the slave trade was significantly smaller, and the demand did not exceed the, let's say, the availability of slaves. So the importance of these things is that because of these things, it does not fundamentally change the structure of Africa, right? Where we'll see with the Europeans and the Atlantic slave trade, it's going to. Okay, so that's the Ottomans, and with the Europeans then, and then we'll get into with how that looked for women and stuff. Oh, and the Ottomans, let's put also for here, while men were still higher demand for slaves, they were interested in women. We'll put that as a separate one here. Women were wanted as slaves for entertainment. And while, of course, that could be sex slaves, one of the things was actually as dancers. And they ended up being highly trained to be these dancers. And then domestic. These were the two main things. So yes, sex slavery is always there for women in the background, sometimes at the forefront, but also in the background. There's no way that when you have slavery and women that there isn't sex slavery. But the main aspects for women within the Ottoman Empire were to be used as these dancers that became super highly trained and actually were able to then use that to negotiate certain freedoms and opportunities that often allowed them to end out of slavery in a generally well-off position, or with domestic work. And so while men were still largely the larger percentage being brought over, when they were interested in women for these purposes. And for the Europeans then, we'll put the number again, or I'll just put the title so it's clear which is which, right? So let me put the Ottomans here so it's clear what we're talking about. For the Europeans, you have kind of an initial structure of what they did and then how it changed. So they initially were looking to travel to Africa for trade, and there was a variety of things that they were looking to trade. The biggest thing, though, was gold. There had been past rumors of that there was a lot of gold in Africa. Some of this came from the stories in Mali of Mansa Musa, who was supposedly the wealthiest king pretty much anywhere. I mean, there is a map of the kind of main important parts of the world in that time period, and he is pictured on it, which is important because like this map was only had pictures of like the key players or areas, and he was there and he's shown with like these gold bars, because he went on the Hajj, because he was Muslim, and when he went on the Hajj he brought this massive entourage and a ton of gold, and gave away a lot of it on the trip. Supposedly so much that he destabilized the currency in Egypt because of how much was dropped into the Egyptian economy from him and his entourage going for his Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. And so rumors spread of the insane wealth that this king had, and it kind of got solidified in people's minds of just this wealth to be had in Africa. And so when people began looking to make trade routes to Africa, one of the things they were looking for was gold. Of course, we can put and goods, because of course their other goods were always on the table, but there was kind of this interest in gold. And when that doesn't pan out, they're going to shift to slaves as the quick way to make money. But Mansa Musa definitely had this kind of legend surrounding him after his death, of that wealth and that prosperity that potentially existed. And he made a lot of his money in the salt trade. Again, it was a super valuable commodity at the time. You needed it for preserving your food, for making things taste better. People wanted it. It wasn't available everywhere. And so you could sell it for quite a lot of money in trade. And he became extremely wealthy from that. And that kind of became like, he became a landmark and again, the fact that they used gold to symbolize the connection to him showcases what he was connected to. So they looked to travel for gold goods. And one of the things is that Europeans, like they traveled, they wanted to go to places where investors wanted to go, where it was a known deal. Like, it's one of the reasons Christopher Columbus wasn't supported early on, was because most people, they said you underestimated how the circumference of the world, so you're going to end up in the middle of the ocean if there's no continent over there, and you're going to die. And no one wanted to invest money into that, which wasn't a kind of a sure, known entity. Well, the trade routes to Africa, or at least the areas to Africa, were known enough that people were willing to invest in that. It's why they stuck to the coast, though. Right, this area is safe. That's safe. They didn't go other places because it was coastal. You could stop. You weren't going to likely die in the middle of the ocean. And then as the trade with Africa took root, it was a known entity for success. And so they initially started looking for gold, but very quickly realized that there was an easier thing than trying to do negotiation and trade. Again, the Ottoman Empire, they worked with the local people and did these trades. So it was normal trade structures with the Europeans, the Portuguese first, and then subsequent Europeans. They realized that what they could do is they could do quick raids. So you go along the coast and you dock your ship, and then you raid coastal areas, coastal kingdoms and towns, and you grab whatever you can, and so that, right, goods, food, people, right, anything. The goal being to avoid conflict. I mean, I suppose, right, avoiding conflict would have been to do normal trading. But since they realized that it was cheaper to just steal it, this was what they did initially. And this worked for a while. It worked until it didn't work. So it worked initially. And this is not, the people were part of kind of everything else, but it wasn't a slave trade system yet. But then what happened is, a couple different things, is that either the coastal towns moved and left to avoid, and villages left. The larger kingdoms didn't leave, but the smaller villages and towns, people moved. They got tired of being kidnapped and attacked and raided. Others were that people were now prepared to fight back. The other thing happened was that they made a deal. So the larger kingdoms, what they did is they said, you know, look, you, instead of raiding us, stop raiding us and trade with us instead, right? So trade instead, and we will procure what you want. And so what they did is they basically, you know, said that they would offer safe passage to their land, and then they would trade with them. And in return, what they ended up wanting after initial trading was weapons, European weapons. So what it became was weapons for people. So how did it shift to people? Well, the realization that there wasn't a lot of gold that they were going to find, and the other goods and stuff were fine, but people, right, for slaves is where you could make the money. Because you had these new colonies that were opening up, and they needed, so again, well, let's put it with the money part here. This was with new colonial discoveries, places, they needed labor. So it was timing of it too, that as this was taking place, then you had a need for labor and slave labor, and because the gold wasn't there, then the people became the next best thing of what they could make the most money. And so this led to the start of the slave trade, which used coastal towns as the intermediary. And the Europeans set up slave buildings, barracks, basically, for holding. And then the coastal kingdoms who were working with them would go inland to provide people for slaves. When they started initially, the demand worked to have it be just captured warriors, right? So when the demand was low, it didn't disrupt the normal system that was already playing out at the start in Africa. But as time went on, the demand increased. And this meant that they had to start going in and attacking and raiding villages and towns to get enough people. When they started, men were most wanted as slaves because they were wanting them for, right, plantation labor. And so they looked at men as being the best option for that labor. As time continued and the demand increased, women and children became more frequent, we'll say, as well. So the earliest slave trade with the Europeans was largely men. But as time went on, it shifted to including women and children, in part just because of the sheer number of people that they needed to provide for the slave trade. There's also going to be some changes in laws, and that will make sense when we talk about the laws from 1643 and 1662, and how that made women actually more valuable as slaves in many cases. This, right, one of the last things with this, and then we'll look at the colonial structures, this fundamentally changed the structure of Africa. Because, let's put that as C. For a couple reasons. One of the things was that they changed because of weapons and we'll say alliance, kind of alliance, trade deal, right? This allowed certain kingdoms that were part of this to grow more powerful. And it allowed them to take over and conquer other societies that didn't have the guns and the support and the wealth that they were earning from the slave trade. And so it fundamentally shifted borders and kingdoms and towns and alliances within Africa because of that. And then, of course, you had a massive population drain with men being removed from society. This left women and children running their villages, and in many ways fundamentally changing the structure of those towns and villages, as most of the men disappeared in some of these villages. There were some areas they were able to resist the attacks, but there's lots of stories of children being told by their mothers, because their mothers were the head of the household now because the fathers were not present and there were very few men within the town or village, and the mothers warning their children that they had to stay inside the village, and at night you made sure you were inside because raiders would come at night and kidnap the kids, because they were, again, it's these stages, right? Captured warriors, then raiding the villages in town and taking them in, then looking towards women and children, then simply just looking to steal children because they were the easiest to steal. And so there's stories of these boys and girls that talked about later how their mothers would warn them that they must be inside before it gets dark, and they had to, and during the day they could only play right around the village. And the stories of mothers paying super close attention to watching their children even during the day, because these raiders would come and kidnap any child that strayed too far and was easy to grab without being noticed. And so that kind of fear and constant alertness really, is significant in a child's development, let alone the kind of culture and structure in a town society that's based around fear, because these smaller villages and towns could not compete with these larger kingdoms and areas that had participated in this slave trade with the Europeans, with the Portuguese and others. And then of course, like I said, the massive population drain then creates a whole drain on technology development. It's called a brain drain too, because basically you took all those people that had the potential for doing things in Africa, and discovering things, inventing things, participating in the cultural development, and that was stolen. And then the economic drain of it, because of those towns not having the men around to help with the general economy, with labor, you have an economic drain. So there's all of these domino effect of consequences because of this. All right, so let's look at then how this shifts with the Atlantic slave trade. What number on? 4, I think 3. How the Atlantic slave trade comes about, and what colonial labor looked like, colonial slave labor, colonial labor in general. So we'll say colonial labor and transition to slavery. I'm not going to talk too much about the early structures because we've talked about them, but I want to point them out, right? So the earliest labor that was used in the colonies was Native American. I left out that part of it, getting ahead of myself. Native American labor. The first groups of people that the colonists tried to use, and that definitely was more in the traditional sense, is conquering. We come in, we conquer, we take the people we conquer. And so they tried to use Native Americans as slaves. But there were several things that made this difficult and then ultimately not successful. High death rates due to disease, right? Unknowingly and unintentionally, Europeans brought over lots of diseases that the Native Americans didn't have immunities to. They also often just refused to work. It was easier to run away and not get caught too. So we'll see. This is one of the things with when they start bringing over Africans, that you can't blend in back into a group of people. There were no free black populations at the beginning to where you could possibly do this, nor were there free northern states, which was another place that slaves later ran away to. For Native Americans, it was easier to run away and not be found. Because they would simply, they knew, well, one, it was their land, they knew the area better, they knew places and tribes they could go to live, and you weren't going to find them. And then lastly, just resistance and rebellion. All of these things meant that it was not viable, and it became too difficult. So they moved to indentured servants, which started as British citizens, and then eventually moved to other European, Irish, German, who they looked down upon and saw as less. So there definitely was a hierarchy of indentured servants, British first, others, right? So this was a term service, 5 to 7 years. It was both men and women. And interestingly enough, right, when we talked about this, both men and women came over as indentured servants, and both were used for tobacco field labor. Women as indentured servants won't start to be used in the domestic sense until African slaves start coming over in a larger number. This also becomes problematic because of Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion was a pushback against, well, not really much indentured servant structure, because, right, they did get benefits. Besides the term service, the headright system gave them land. And so many, people most of the time chose this in order to get land. We did have the case where we looked at the girl who was, her father sent her over, and so there definitely were some that didn't have choice, or tobacco brides that ended up having to become indentured servants. But a lot of people, men and women, chose to be indentured servants, especially, again, women usually chose tobacco bride first. But as the population, or the gender ratio equalized, that became less of an option, and women then still chose to be indentured servants because of the potential to get land and opportunity that they wouldn't have back in England. So yeah, definitely tobacco brides first were women's choices because it was a better choice than indentured servant. But eventually the tobacco brides go away way before the indentured servants do, because of the gender ratio equalizing out. And so it gave some opportunities for women that they otherwise wouldn't have. But as the thing is that they tried to make indentured servants slaves as well. They started increasing the term of service. Eventually it was not 5 to 7 years, but 7 to 10 years. And then they created a massive list of all these infractions that they could add time for. And we talked about those, like, right, if a woman got pregnant, which, again, sexual abuse for women was, well, we'll come back to Bacon's Rebellion in just a second. So you do have sexual abuse for women was always something that was problematic, even though there was a term service. You still have that they were technically the owner and master for that term of service, and they took advantage of that. And this was you were penalized twice for the sexual abuse that you endured and the rape, and then on top of that, extended time while pregnant. To the entire pregnancy plus lost time after that, even though you were working through most of that. And then, of course, poor conditions and everything else. This is going to lead to Bacon's Rebellion. But more and more people don't want to become indentured servants, and the conditions, or don't like being indentured servants. So you have Bacon's Rebellion and indentured servants who ran away. And part of this was just realizing, like, oh yeah, wait, we're British citizens. We have rights. You can't do some of these things that you've been doing, because the plantation owners were trying to make them into slaves by creating this massive punishment and list of expanding the term. So like you may start out with 5 to 7 years, and then with all these silly infractions, it goes to 15 years, because the longer they could make it, the less indentured servants they had to buy. And it was as silly as, it was more serious as the sexual abuse against women, and if they got pregnant by that, then they were penalized for that. To you talked back to the owner, and therefore that's an extra 3 months. And that was one of the things. If you talked back, if you were disrespectful, if you had an attitude, that was like a 3-month extension, and that could be added every day. If you were seen as not productive, if you hunted for food, so they would intentionally like not give them enough food, and then when they went to hunt to have enough food, you were penalized if you got caught hunting. All of this led to more and more indentured servants running away, and then eventually Bacon's Rebellion, where it was an armed rebellion of past and some current indentured servants that overthrew Jamestown and the governor, and occupied it for a little bit. That scared the crap out of the elite and the indentured servant owners, who began, it isn't the only thing, that was in 1617-6, so slavery is already going to come in, but it's the beginning of the transition to using slaves more often, and the transition away from indentured servants to solely using African slaves, and that is combined with, like I said, Bacon's Rebellion. Also, that the mortality rate for slaves, African slaves, had begun to decline, and in 1698 you have you had a monopoly before that on the slave trade that went away, and so then prices began to go down. Let's put that change where we'll put change to, so we'll say African slavery. I'll talk about, I'll write those down first because that's important to change, and then we're gonna go back in time just look at really early slavery, and then as it really shifts. So you have that move away from indentured servants, right, as we'll say the reasons for shifting to slavery. Again, we're going to kind of go back to, there were slaves very, very early on in the early 1600s, but they were very few in number compared to when this transition happens, right? So the first was that the Bacon's Rebellion and resistance, just like with the Native Americans, this concerned them. The other was the mortality rate declined for African slaves. Early slaves were much more likely to die of disease. And then it became a cheaper labor source. Early slaves were very expensive, but when you have the monopoly on the slave trade ended, right, then that allowed for again, competition and cheaper prices. And just to show like how this ultimately led to change, in the 1650s in Virginia, which was the main area, you're going to have two areas, the Chesapeake and the Carolinas. But in Virginia in 1650, you had 300 slaves. In 1700, it jumped to 13,000, and in 1750s, it had risen to 150,000 people. And that's when you're going to shift to a more of a slave-based society. So looking at, that was the reasons, but if we go back in time, right, slaves were around before 1650. a little bit before. There were very few. Right, you saw 1650. There were 300. So there were some from almost the beginning of the colonial period, after Jamestown started to become successful. But you're gonna have more and more that emerge after that. But from the 1650s until the 1750, between the 1650s and 1750s, there were 39% of the 1 million Africans that were brought over were women. It's from 1650s to 1750s, of the 1 million is brought over, 39% were women. You had, so just even if we're looking at in these very earlier years of experience of women and structure, women that were the Middle Passage. So the Middle Passage was the most brutal part of the whole thing, because it was the longest at sea. And so you had the roughest and worst conditions, but the entire slave ship was just a horrible experience. Within the slave ship in the Middle Passage, you had women were placed in segregated quarters. So they separated most of the time. Smaller slave ships sometimes didn't do this because they didn't have enough space. But the larger slave ships, they would have them in segregated quarters where women were stripped naked. And then because of this, so you were naked for pretty much most of the journey. And then because of this and because they were women, they were often terrorized, sexually assaulted, and raped during the voyage. You did have women who gave birth during the voyage, usually during the Middle Passage, because it was just the longest period, so it was the most likely time, and which was very dangerous for many reasons. One, it was crowded in the quarters, and you rarely had there was almost no room to move. So the ability to give birth was difficult just based on space. You were not given extra food for being pregnant, and there was rarely enough food anyway, right, for non-pregnant women, for anyone, but right, pregnant women, you need more, and there was almost never enough food just for people in general, let alone being pregnant and trying to have the nutrients for that, and so the risk of complications, we'll just say the risk of death was high. Worse, if you looked too sick or issues with having a baby, with, we'll say, giving birth, they usually they threw you overboard. So especially for sickness, usually for it varied for pregnancy. So there wasn't the threat of sickness spreading because you were sick with childbirth or near death because of that. And so sometimes if you died, then they'd throw you overboard and they'd wait till you died. But there were other times where women who were deteriorating quickly during childbirth or the baby wasn't coming out, they would simply toss them overboard while the woman was not dead and still technically giving birth. And then anyone, men and women who were sick, if it wasn't mild and you didn't recover quickly, you were also often thrown overboard while still alive. And so you had, like I said, the added risk of women who were pregnant, or who had children with them, because they often were giving what food they had to their children. These women were more likely to be killed during the Middle Passage, let alone women who resisted the sexual abuse and rape were also likely to face various punishments and or being tossed overboard as well. So women definitely had a higher risk of surviving through the Middle Passage. And that was, like I said, this terrorizing, horrible experience. And then we'll see that sex was used against them. Women, more than men, were, being naked, having sexual humiliation, the assault, that was so often used against them as a method of control, as well as children being used as a method of control. So threatening the children, threatening separating the family, threatening killing the babies or your children, all used more often against women as a method of control than men. All right, the two locations were the main areas were the Chesapeake with Virginia, and then in the southern area, the Carolinas. And Virginia was tobacco for the field work. Carolinas, there was indigo, but rice was the number one commodity. So these were the two locations where early slaves went the most. So they mostly were sent to these two places. And that was based on the fact of what they were producing and the labor that they needed for that. With this, in the Carolinas, rice farming it's not rice farming. We'll say the Carolinas, because of rice farming, we'll put it that way. Women were more desired in the early period, because again, it was still largely men until the 1650s, where then you have about 39%, from 1650 to 1750, 39%. Prior to that, it was almost exclusively men. There were very, very few women in those early years, because at the beginning of the slave trade, right, they were largely bringing men over, thinking men for field labor, men for labor. That's who we're going to put into that. That's who's going to produce the most. And there's going to be reasons why in 1650 it significantly upticks. So if you're looking at the early period before the 1650s, while it was mostly men, women were largely taken to the Carolinas. Because of rice production, women were used as slaves here. You did have a few that went to the Chesapeake region, but that increases significantly after the 1650s. And the reason for this was because that African women, some, again, it depended on the region, but a lot of African women had knowledge and experience with rice cultivation. And so they wanted them because of their ability to work within that. The issue with the Carolinas, though, of course, was that it had a much higher death rate, and in part because the labor was brutal, and higher disease, because you were in standing water, And one, the brutal aspect of the labor. So you had these women that were in standing water that were constantly bending down and picking up. And then because of standing water, there were more mosquitoes and other diseases that they contracted and died from. Then because the labor was so hard, many died, like worked to death. And early slave labor kind of followed that structure of the West Indies, where that was also kind of the policy that took place. So some of the earliest slaves that were women were actually put in the most brutal and harsh conditions for slave labor. Tobacco was difficult, but not like rice cultivation was. In the Carolinas, they were treated far worse than other areas. The other thing that was difficult for women is that these early periods, you had a low percentage of women and slaves overall. So there was often this isolation. There were areas where there would only be one or two slaves in that whole area. Again, we'll see by the 1650s, that's changed. But in the 1620s, 1630s, you'd have these areas where there would be 1 to 2 slaves in the entire area, and so you were very isolated. Of course, this also meant low to no birth rates, which meant that you didn't have a continuation of the population, which would create a larger slave population and a larger African-American community that develops with the slaves later. And so all of these things led to a very isolated and kind of lonely and harsh labor condition for women, especially because there were more men that were brought over than women. So even in a lower slave population area, because they were still actively using indentured servants at this point, while there might be a few men in the same under the same owner, there rarely were multiple women under the same owner. Again, there were very few women even in the same region, let alone multiple women in the same one. And so this creates not only lower birth rates for continuing a population, but also a lack of community. And community is super important. Having a sense of community, having a sense of identity and agency within that community, even if it's for a very short period of time, is incredibly important. And that sense of isolation and lack of community, they actually think also helped lead to higher death rates, because human beings need that. And when that is removed, it often leads to problems, health problems, and then death. And you see that with isolation in jails when they put them in the hole. It's mentally damaging if you're in the hole too long, and because you're isolated and you're by yourself. And they that alone, like I said, there's an easy, clear connection of mental decline in people and prisoners who are kept in the hole too long. And many argue that it's abusive. And there's a difference between putting someone in for 24 hours to calm down versus keeping someone in for a year. And that's proven, like, the damage that does. So in the same sense, even though you're not in an isolated room, being isolated with no other community, with no other people that you can identify with, no other Africans from your area that you can speak with, no sense of community, that it was devastating to the health and well-being of these women. So that's the early area with the Carolinas. But as more and more slaves were brought over in the transition, it was common with the Chesapeake. So we'll put the Chesapeake here, and in Virginia as that main area, that both women and men that were slaves worked in the fields. So much like early indentured servants, when they started bringing more slaves over, both slave men and women worked in the fields, just like indentured men and women worked in the field, right? They didn't, because it was all about tobacco. plantations, right? The indentured servants, whether they were men or women, were brought over to help with the tobacco plantations. And then that didn't change when slaves were beginning to be brought over and used for that as well. What is significant to look at is that why they wanted men first, because they thought they would produce more. But as women started to come over, their field work, women's production in field labor was almost always equal to men. And they know this from ledgers in what was produced by each slave. And so this is one thing where you see the value of women for slave owners begin to be seen as equally fine to men. But, right, so they were producing the same amount as men in field labor and work, but to purchase a female slave was cheaper, because there still was a general perception that people wanted men more than women for the field labor, even though as farmers began to use slaves, they realized that women were producing the same amount, so they could buy women as slaves for less than men and still get the same amount of production. Now, that didn't ever end the desire for strong men for that labor too, but it was one of those things that is going to help increase ultimately the number of women that ended up being used as slaves because of that recognition. Now, the other thing that was super important with this were changing laws. So let's see, we're on 5. There are 2 main laws that take place that are going to fundamentally change women's roles in slavery in these early periods. The first was in 1643. So we'll say the law of 1643. And the next one will be 1662. The law in 1643, what it did is that it specified a tax on male labor and black female labor. So what's important with this is there was an expectation so that you're using labor for profit to make money. So then they wanted to tax people, the owners, on any laborers that they had that were then producing that amount of money. This is important with that because it tells us something important about the beginning transition to view slavery and race. And I skipped a part. I want to go back. We're going to talk about this in a minute. I just realized I skipped one part that's super important. So let me go back. Sorry. We will come back to this. I do want to talk about, I'm getting ahead of myself here with this. We'll go with 5. We'll go with 5 here. So it's still 5, but I skipped an important part that I want to talk about with the structure. And then we'll talk about the laws, because there is one other thing that's really important. So we'll say the structure of early slavery, because these laws change this. The early structure of slavery was really, in many ways, one, there was not a single structure established or required. So it did depend on the owner, right, with so many things about the conditions. We saw that with like indentured servants too. But in the early periods, before 1643, many slaves were treated like indentured servants, especially in the Chesapeake area, not in the Carolinas, but in the Chesapeake area. Many were they were treated like indentured servants, or what we'll see, they were really treated like slavery was practiced around the rest of the world. And so many owners freed slaves after a term of service that was typical of indentured servants. Even though there was not a contract for that, we have records of slaves being freed after so many years of work. They also were able to purchase their own freedom. Once free, and we do know the other thing with this is that there was free time, there was downtime, there was also the ability to make money, both men and women, on the side, which could help you purchase your freedom, and you did have more free time. Again, these should sound familiar to what we were talking about with the early structures of slavery. In the early colonial period, the colonists tended to treat the earliest period of slavery for both men and women much like the rest of the world. There wasn't a race-based component. How we know this has to do with really what happens after slaves were freed. So you do start to have a free black population that begins to emerge because of that system. And within the free black population, we know that they were able to purchase land. We have records of former slaves that then not only had tobacco fields, but owned slaves themselves. They also were able to, they had legal rights, more men than women, again, because of men and women. The example of that was that there was a former slave, and he bought a farm, a tobacco farm, after he was freed, and had slaves. And his owner, or not his owner, sorry, the neighbor stole some of his slaves. And so he went to court and sued his neighbor. So the ability to sue was a big thing. And he won in court. So what's significant about this is that it tells us that race was not yet implemented in that. Not only because it was functioning like it did in Africa and around the world, that they weren't slaves anymore, now they could own slaves, and they owned slaves. And when they were free, they could buy land, they could get married, they could sue. There was also some suggestion of early voting rights for men only. Women still could not vote. And so this, they were part of an informal government, right? All of that. Anthony Johnson was the name of the former slave that then sued in court. So you had these things that clearly showed that it was functioning more like a typical system. The difference is, right, that the slaves were only coming from Africa, and so that alone is going to allow it to create it into a race-based system, because it's only one specific people. That's one of the big differences, right? That is, everywhere else with slavery, they usually were pulling from all different groups of people, so it didn't get classified into a single group of people. But here you have slaves only coming from Africa. And then you're going to have these laws. So now we get to the laws. But I wanted to make sure that early slavery for women was, like I said, pretty brutal because of the isolation and the lack of numbers, along with the fact that if you were in the Carolinas, it was far worse working conditions, and women were desired there because of their knowledge. But that the way that it was functioning for both men and women was that you had all of these situations that show, with especially one with that slavery wasn't hereditary or even a life term, but then also that within the free black population there was an opportunity to own property, own slaves, participate in the government, be treated as another colonist, essentially. This will change, though, with the laws. So now we get to the laws that I jumped ahead to, which makes more sense with that changes once you understand that. So and both of these laws involve women. So it's also significant that the laws that change the structure of slavery are directly connected to women. The first law was the law of 1643, again, right? And that this was a tax on male labor and black female labor. So what was significant about this is male labor. This was all male labor. So indentured servants or slaves, it didn't matter. Black female labor, even though they didn't say it, right, is that, so that's for slave labor. It did not include white women who were indentured servants. So why were they not in that? Right? What's significant about that? What it tells you is that it's creating a separation of women based on race. And what it's creating is that it's that white women, indentured servants, we'll say white indentured servant women, they were moving to the domestic work. But we know early indentured servants, right? White women worked in the fields. And then it was separated in saying black women who were deemed as slaves, right, that they worked in the fields. And why we know this is because they were only taxing what was seen as profitable labor. This was a tax that had happened before. And so they only were taxing labor that was making you a profit. Domestic work was not seen as making a profit. That was just stuff around the house, right? But field labor was making you a profit. So the key with this is it's the first law that clearly separates, not for men yet, but women based on race. The idea that black women are working in the fields, and it's implying that white women are not taxed anymore because they're not working in the fields anymore, they're being in domestic labor. And so why that would happen is it's not what created the divide, but it's suggesting that there was a separation that was taking place based on race for women, where white women, as more and more slaves came in, began to be transferred out of the field work into domestic work, where slave women were left in the fields. And then it became an assumption that meant that black women worked in the fields and white women worked in the house. And so that's why that one's important, is because you have that first example of a separation or segregation of labor based on race for women. The next law is even more important, the law of 1662. So the law of 1662 did two things. This is one. It made bond. Well, actually, I guess it did three things really. So it made bondage an inherited condition. which is significant because this is going to further the race-based system of slavery, because it's saying not only is slavery for a lifetime, but your children are slaves as well. And once you then do that, it locks in slaves purely as a specific group of people. Only those who are slaves will ever have more slaves and become slaves. No one else outside of that group of slaves, it becomes slaves. And so it sets up that slavery is only going to be from Africa, and clearly distinguishes and delineates a race-based system of slavery. The second thing that it did that was connected to this, which is why I said two at first, but it really is a separate thing that happens, is that the condition of bondage or servitude, we'll just say slavery, or the condition of the child, we'll say that, is based on the mother. Right, so this is significant for several reasons. One of the things that it establishes, right, so is that if the mother is free, child is free. If the mother is a slave, right, the child is a slave. So it sets up the conditions for that, right, of how it's inherited. And this is going to then create the where it gets to the race-based system, if it's going to let me draw here, is that, right, this is going to establish very clearly white equals free, black equals slave. And that's where you then get a full race-based system of slavery. Right, it started with tax and separating labor based on race, but the law of 16.2 clearly creates the race-based system. What's also significant about this in terms of having the mother and her condition be the condition of the child is that this creates it as matrilineal. And right, we've seen that society in every other aspect up to this point and after is patrilineal. Everything else is patrilineal. It has always been patrilineal. So they intentionally shift this one thing to be matrilineal, right? That not the normal system. And the reason that they do this is because you know who the mother is. If they follow the normal patrilineal lines, then there's no DNA testing. There's no way to be certain of who the father is, and this way there's no questioning who the mother is, and then it makes it a guarantee of knowing what the condition of the child is going to be. There is also a second part to this, which was that which this was already happening, slave owners were raping their slave women, and if it stayed patrilineal, then those children would be born free, because it would follow the patrilineal line of the father as what condition the child inherits, right? If they just set up and said slavery is an inherited condition based on normal traditions of patrilineal line, then any children produced by white men essentially raping slave women, all those children would be free. The other connection was just simply, well, if you were a slave woman and you wanted to make sure that your child would be born free, you make sure you say the father is someone who is free. And they can't really prove that at this point in time, right? There's no DNA testing to determine that. So the way around that is to completely upturn the system that they normally follow for just this instance, right? Everything else is still patrilineal. The name, the inheritance for white families and their children, as far as the wealth and that type of stuff, is all through the patrilineal line. But in this one thing, they upended the whole patrilineal structure and made it matrilineal, even though nothing ever has been up to that point, and nothing else after is, so that this system can work. And this has super negative consequences for women. This is the fundamental shift I was talking about for women in slavery, right? Is you had, so think 1662, 1650, they were just starting. You only had 300 African slaves in Virginia, and 1662 is just a little bit after that. 1700, 13,000. So there were still not a lot of women as slaves in the colonies. There were some, but there was not a ton. And while we talked about these different ways that women could be used or were favored in the Carolinas, men were still the main source of slavery. This makes it so that women become much more valuable as slaves. And it's thus why from 1650 to 1750, which is really really not at 1650, but the later periods, you have 39% of slaves are women, because there is a massive uptick. And that's just those that are being brought over with the Atlantic slave trade. It's not going to include those who are born into slavery, right? So the number of women who are slaves increases significantly, because they now become much more valuable as slaves. Because, right, they produce more slaves through their children. You don't want to buy another slave? Well, if you just get some female slaves, and then they can have children, and those children now automatically become slaves themselves. And so the act of childbirth is essentially, and children are stolen from slave women, and used for profit. That was the purpose. And so then you have more people wanting female slaves, so that they can increase their slave population without having to buy all of the new slaves. So that's one thing, right? So you get a massive increase in interest in women, initially from the Atlantic slave trade, and then just in general from slaves that are born in the colonies. It's not the United States yet, because of this new value. The other thing is that it encourages rape, because and by the owners. So there's two things with this. That's one, right? Because that can produce children. The other thing that it encourages slave owners to force the slave women to have children with other slaves. So essentially, so if it isn't one where they rape them, then many slave owners would basically say, you are going to have sex with this person, and you're going to have children, and you didn't have a choice in it. And there were punishments and consequences if you didn't produce children. And so it takes and completely removes any sexual freedom or agency from slave women, and becomes a system of abuse, significant abuse. And all of a sudden, slavery, as dangerous as it was, just from the labor and physical abuse that could happen, punishment from work, you now have an entirely new component of abuse on women in slavery. because of this law. And that becomes, and we're going to talk more about this with when we talk about slavery in the South, because it's entrenched by that point on how women, and the anxiety of having daughters and raising daughters and knowing the potential of what's to come for them. And how do you be a mother and raise your kid and try to give them a sense of self, and yet prepare them for that horror that's to come, and that struggle as a mother that now exists because of this law. And so it had incredibly horrible consequences for women, because and I think this also shows the difference as it's shifting to race-based slavery. You're also seeing, especially women, no longer seen as human beings, but as livestock, right, for breeding, and those terms were used in the language of slave owners in records and things like that they were paired up specifically to have children, that they weren't seen as human beings anymore, and instead were a thing to be used. And I'm not saying that wasn't somewhat there before, but so much more with this law that comes in. The other thing that the law does, is that it said that they imposed stiff penalties on white people who had, it was really white women who had sex with black men. So technically, and this was to coincide with trying to make sure that that you're separating the races, essentially. So the second part of this law was that it made it illegal with strict penalties. There was a couple different penalties, not only monetary but sometimes jails, for technically, we'll put what it really was: white women having sex with black men. Technically, the law just said white people could not have sex, no sex with black people. And it didn't say women, but right, men were rarely charged with this law, right? Slave owners and other white men that were in positions of power over slaves often had sex with slave women, and raped them or forced them into it in various ways, or used their position of power. And they weren't charged with anything. The only people who were charged by this law, even though technically it applied to all white men and women, were white women. And it was something that was not uncommon for white indentured servant women to get into relationships with black slaves, male slaves. And that they have records that this was common only in relationships, but getting married, interracial marriage was not illegal before these laws. Interracial marriage becomes illegal as a law in 1691. Right, so if we could put C here. Law of 1691, they move forward with it being more specific with that. So interracial marriage became illegal. So that's certainly like the continuation of laws of separating races. But that's what this was attempting to do with just having sex. So it wasn't saying like, I mean, technically that meant the relationship too, but it was targeted towards specifically having sex. Then that became illegal. But they only charged women for that, and then of course penalized the black men as well. And then in 1691, you set up and say interracial marriage is illegal. And then there's other laws too. Even before 1691, 1672, it became legal to kill any slave who resisted arrest or capture. And they also limited, so there's a series of laws, 1667, 1672, 1667, baptism, you could not, they set up that baptism didn't free a slave. Because there were those who questioned the rules with Christianity and said Christians couldn't own Christian slaves. Therefore, if a slave became baptized in a Christian, then they couldn't be a slave anymore. So they made a law to make sure you couldn't get out of slavery through religion. Then they made the law that physical violence and death could be imposed upon slaves. And then they made a law that interracial marriage was illegal to further separate the idea of white as free and black as slave. So all of these things, and again, most of this was looking at women. Yes, interracial marriage could be for both men and women, as the white person in that marriage, but largely both of these things here were targeting women and black men. Because white men were still allowed to kind of do what they want. Now, not marriage, but that's who they were looking to try to prevent it in most cases. It wasn't the men who were marrying black women or slave women. It was largely the white indentured servant women who were marrying and having relationships with slaves. And so that was looking to do this. So all of this, the significance of these laws and these changes in the system to race-based slavery, besides, of course, the fact that it has a much worse condition. We'll put first that women's condition and treatment as slaves, not slavery, as slaves becomes far worse. Right? So that's definitely one of the consequences. And then in general, you have that conditions for slaves for all get worse, and stricter laws, because you now have a system of it being a race-based slavery, right? You are a slave for life. And not just that, it's generational. And so your children are slaves, which generational, right, is worse than just slave for life, because now there's no escape. And these are things that make that shift slavery in the colonial world and then later the United States to a very, very different system of slavery than the rest of the world. The early stuff we were talking about, they mirrored a lot of what the rest of the world did with slavery. With these laws, with the shift to race-based slavery, the colonial world and later the U.S., like I said, created a new system of slavery that was not practiced anywhere else in the world. And it created, like I said, these worse conditions and transition to slaves not being seen as human beings. There were no rights anymore. With that transition, they removed all of the rights for owning, making money, free time, all of those that we listed early on, they went away. And not only that, it impacted the free black population, because it was a race-based system. Even though they were not slaves, they lost rights and freedoms as well. Not becoming slaves again, although in some cases were kidnapped, but the ability to purchase land, the ability to own slaves, the ability to participate in the government, that all got removed, because you now have a racist system that is establishing that group of people are not human, and they shouldn't have the same rights as white people. They also, for slaves, increased working hours, which is within the free time, went away. Limited gatherings. So this was out of fear of Bacon's rebellion. As the slave population began to increase, right, especially as it moved up towards around the 150,000 range, gathering sizes. It was an attempt to control not only that there wouldn't be rebellion, but also control the sense of community, physical violence, and sexual violence, although that was kind of okay already. We'll say legalized as acceptable. And all of this ultimately is going to establish the plantation elite as fully in charge. And that's going to have it shift to what will become the Southern slavery, as well as a slave society. So what you get, right, is that you have, as the population increases, for slaves, population of slaves increases, and society, culture, laws, and economics get structured around slavery. It becomes a slave society. So there's a difference, right? You can have a slave society or a society with slaves. A slave society is where it's what I just mentioned. Culture, laws, economics everything is structured around the practice of slavery. A society with slaves is a society that has slaves, but their entire system is not based upon that, right? This is what the South becomes. So that's where we're going to end, because we're going to pick it back up with when we get to the antebellum period right before the Civil War. And we're going to look at how, as all of this takes place, like how this shapes it, and we're going to look at women's roles within that system, and look a little more detailed at how slave women were treated. Because of course, what's going to happen is, right, as this shifts to a race-based system, the other thing, indentured servants end. And women, white women are no longer indentured servants, and they're not working in the domestic sphere or in the house. And so slave women then take over that role almost exclusively. Slave women become house slaves, and then you have the field slaves. And all of that labor is now an insane amount of labor within even the house system of cooking, cleaning, dressing, raising the children, all gets taken up by slave women. And so their roles, their experiences, the structure becomes dominated by women in many ways, especially as house slaves, but even in the field, and then the slave communities and their roles. So we will pick that back up and look at that when we get to the antebellum period.